So council has to approve the draft statement of intent by the 30th of June this year, and if you do have any changes to this, they will have to go back to the HBRIC board again and then come back to council by the 26th of June. So I'll hand over to Mr. Caldwell and he can go through some of those, particularly board changes, I think, the ones in paragraph 6 again.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't intend to go through the SOI in detail itself. I think it's more important to go through the changes that the board discussed at its meeting on the 20th of May. So as Liz has outlined, 6.1 is an extension of the date in which the transition board be replaced with an ongoing board. It's currently 1 January 2014. There's a proposal to extend this to 1 July 2014, and as Liz mentioned, this was discussed at the workshop last week. 6.2 talks about the perceived conflicts of interest, and this is a proposal that has come about because of concerns that have been raised. 6.3 is just an addition to the government's section of the SOI, which talks about board committees. We've currently got the Audit and Risk Committee and the Governance and Remuneration Committee. This just provides a little bit of detail around the newly established RWS Board Committee. And finally, we have the changes to sections 6 and 7, which are on pages 10 and 11 of the SOI. And these just reflect the latest financial forecasts undertaken by the board for 2013 and the additional 2 years. Council officers have reviewed the statement of intent. I think it's important to note that the dividend proposed to be paid by HBRIC Limited to HBRC of 6.55 million ties in with what's reflected in the latest draft annual plan. So those are the 4 major changes that the board have refined from the draft that you saw in February, and also the other changes that were reflected in paragraph 5, which council advised in February. So I suppose if just any questions about any of those changes.
Councillor Curtin.
Can you tell me if on page 9, those board committees, have they respective terms of reference for the committees? Have they been developed?
Terms of reference for the Audit and Risk Management Committee and the Government's Appointments and Remuneration Committee have been approved by the board.
Are they tabled anywhere?
They've been tabled at a board meeting. I don't think they've come through council. No.
Can we see those?
Certainly, yes.
The other aspect of it, in particular relation to the Governance Appointment and Remuneration Committee, and without the terms of reference, it's difficult to comment, but I'm assuming that there's a reference to the remuneration, governance remuneration to come back to council. Is that ultimately who decides the remuneration for the governance of the HBRIC?
Yeah, it ultimately is the shareholder that approves the remuneration,
and will
based on a recommendation from.
Will that be set out in the terms of reference of those committees?
I'd have to have a look at the terms of reference.
It should be.
Mr. Chair, on that point, following up Neil's point, Councillor Curtin's point, when will that issue of the remuneration for directors be coming back to council, please?
I can answer that, perhaps, Councillor. The HBRIC, as you'll see, has remained silent on this through the statement of intent. It's really up to council to discuss any changes to the constitution, because that's where the fees are established and set out. So it's really for council to instruct staff to bring a paper on directors' fees for that to be considered.
Can I just follow up on this point, please? So we've got to decide if we do that, like that the paper that came last time about that, does that just disappear in the meantime until we request it comes back to us, or how does that work?
What was left lying on the table? She does make a good point, though. Yeah. Perhaps we could see. You might like to comment on that. Short answer is I'm not sure when it's coming back. HBRIC have a meeting in a few weeks, and it will be an agenda item for that.
Mr. Chair, also on page 85 at the top, on this very topic, it does say fees for HBRIC board are set triennially, and which is every 3 years, and directors' fees will not be payable to any councillor. So that's the SO, that's the statement of intent, what it says. So how does that affect what we're talking about as well? Because that would equally apply to this current board, would it not?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's taken out of the constitution, that statement about the fees being set triennially. And again, I mean, that is for if council, because part of the discussion even when the matter was left to lie on the table was around, well, this is a matter for the constitution, not the statement of intent. But I mean, do notice on the next line about the board recommends fee levels to council based on commercial norms, but discounted to reflect a public service element. So the principles are there, and it's really whether or not the council sees a need to be able to review those fees more regularly than triennially.
So if we approve this today, that will effectively mean that we won't be looking at this issue until 3 years' time.
I think the sentence says HBRIC Limited Board recommends fee levels to council. That has not been done this triennium.
Just in regard to the Constitution and the status thereof, we've got this recommendation of the current board asking for the interim board to continue through an extension to the 30th of June next 2014. What is the status of the transition board in relation to the Constitution? Are they bound by the Constitution? Is it their Constitution? And gets to that issue of the process for setting that remuneration. Can you help us there?
Yeah, my understanding is that the transition board is bound by the Constitution. I mean, council have put through that Constitution to cover all the terms and conditions of setting up HBRIC, and one of which is the appointment of directors and the remuneration of directors, be it a transition board or a full board.
That was contentious at our last meeting, where the status was assumed to be different because it was a transition board, and those terms and conditions didn't apply. So we can confirm that for all intents and purposes, and for the purposes of the activities of the transition board, it assumes the obligations of the Constitution.
Yeah, what we need to look at is whether council deem it appropriate at this time to change certain articles in that Constitution in order to give flexibility on remuneration. Yeah.
Ultimately, it's council's constitution, it's council's board. So
the statement of corporate intent and the Constitution, same thing? No. So where it says, I mean, I'm totally confused now. It says, as Liz said, directors' fees will not be payable to any councillor. That to me is quite agreed to by the council as he stood. So there seems absolutely no point in HBRIC coming back and saying we want to pay the councillors for at least the end of the triennium. Is there some
but if you think back to that paper, councillor, there was a range of fees as set out in other holding company boards throughout the country, but the reality was the recommendation was we go away and explore as a council.
In that case, today we will need to either amend that thing that says director fee will not be payable, or leave it. We have to do that today,
or leave it and consider it at a subsequent date. Yeah.
Well, through Mr. Chairman, the SOI has to be consistent with the Constitution as it stands, and that's exactly what you see. And if it wasn't, then you'd have an issue on that. Yeah. So there's a process here.
Yeah, it does say, if you come back over to 6.2, prepare a report based on recommendation to reduce or avoid actual or perceived conflicts of interest for councillor directors during the decision-making process for RWS. Quite conceivably, the discussion around councillor involvement, etc., could be dealt with at that same time if we re-examine councillor involvement, remuneration, whatever it may be in that process. So.
Councillor Remswell.
Chair, if HBRIC wants to pay all the directors or to increase the fees, then they shouldn't be recommending this SOI because it says differently. They should be wanting to amend those parts.
I think we have some two things up. Hopefully this will clarify it. I think if you separate the two documents, the SOI has got to be consistent with the existing constitution. Okay, so that's the test in relation to this document that you need to approve. But equally, it's possible and sensible on occasion for HBRIC if it considers there's a specific, if the directors consider a specific issue that may need testing the constitution or amendment to the constitution, to bring that as a matter to their shareholder. Then it becomes the shareholder's decision as to whether the issue is legitimate and the constitution should be looked at and amended or not. I think so. Point I'm trying to make is separate the debate about the SOI today from any future debate about the constitution.
This is okay. We're approving this document today, and it's got these elements in it, and whether they come from the constitution, which needs changing, or whether they don't. This is, once we've set this, then that's not what HBRIC wants at the previous meeting when they've asked for changes in fees, is it?
Well, they can't do the point I'm trying to make as a process point is that they can't. The SOI is not the right place for the debate around amending the constitution. That's a specific issue between the shareholder and its directors on specific issues. So they've got to produce an SOI that's consistent with the constitution as it exists, which is done here. And there's a subsequent debate to be had between the shareholder and its board of directors as to whether other issues that may affect the constitution are dealt with. I think that's all.
Yeah, I understand that, but in that case, if it's HBRIC's intention to ask us to change the constitution and therefore change the SOI, we should just leave this and not go through this whole procedure multiple times, surely.
Well, I mean, we're required by the Local Government Act to have a statement of intent finalised and approved by the end of the financial year previous, so by the 30th of June, to take effect from the 1st of July. So this draft statement of intent, assuming that you adopt it today and becomes the final, is in place for the next financial year, 2013-14 financial year. The Constitution is a more permanent document in a sense, and it really drives some of the elements of the statement of intent. So if there is an inconsistency, it's actually relatively easier to change the statement of intent to match the Constitution. But the Constitution is where the real nitty-gritty arguments and points of principle need to be established.
Okay. Can we perhaps park that particular issue and work through the rest of the document?
Yep. Except there's one...
and come back to it, perhaps.
Yeah, there's another issue just
Try
right
and get
here,
in
though,
context.
if I may, because it's just right sitting here. It's about where the fee levels to council of board members based on commercial norms but discounted to reflect a public service element. Now, the 3 associate board members that have been appointed this year, are they paid commercial rates or a discounted public service rate?
Considering the volume of work, they're doing an extremely discounted public service rate.
But they're not directors.
They're not directors. Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Sorry, Councillor.
Director, so
They're not directors.
what's their official title? Board advisors.
Board advisors.
So they're not actual...
They sit on a board committee. They don't sit on the board.
So they're not members of the board?
No.
No. Can we an important discussion, but there's a lot of other stuff to work through as well. So is there any other points that people may have?
2 questions, Mr. Chair. The first is in relation to the relationship between this document and the Constitution, and I haven't done my homework well enough and matched the two. I can't find my Constitution document, but I will do in time. Can has the ruler been passed over this document in relation to the Constitution so that we're in compliance? And perhaps if I could use an example to test that, if I can take you to page 9 of page 85 or page 9, whichever one you want to choose, and subsidiary companies, very bottom of that page, all subsidiary companies are required to submit annual statements of intent to HBRIC, which will evaluate them and suggest changes as considered necessary before finalisation by the company concerned. If any material changes are proposed by subsidiaries, HBRIC will consult with council on such changes. Firstly, I can't recall what the Constitution says about subsidiary companies, but can you assure me that the commentary in the statement of intent aligns with and doesn't omit any significant issues out of the Constitution? Firstly, can we be assured of that?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Can be assured.
Secondly, what on earth does that mean, that paragraph?
That particular point.
Well, that paragraph
paragraph?
there, I'd like to understand what you're trying to tell us.
Subsidiary company is a port,
Yeah, I think
for
that-
example.
I
Just
think
to give an
council
example,
is-
give an example of the port. The port is a subsidiary company of HBRIC Limited, and is required to submit an annual statement of intent to them. And so if you put that in that, insert their name into there, so if there's any material changes proposed by the port, HBRIC has to consult council on those changes.
It's the definition of,
Yeah.
it's the definition of the material. I mean, I would use an example using the port case. If the port, a statement of intent, promoted to its shareholder that wanted to restructure the ownership, for example, the shareholding, the ownership, and through some mechanism, then that would be a clearly material issue that would absolutely trigger the discussion with the owner.
Could you give us an example of a lesser, I mean, that's extreme.
Can I ask you, which I think would be an example? If the port decided to increase its debt to debt equity ratio materially outside the agreed SOI,
Yes, that's
then I assume that couldn't be done without referring back to council.
Yep.